I'm Will Chamberlain,
I'm Amber Duke.
I'm Ben Weingarten.
I'm Inez Stepman.
and this is NatCon Squad, where common good and common sense meet. NatCon Squad is produced by the Edmund Burke Foundation, the home for national conservatism. Subscribe now on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. So today we're going to talk about, obviously there's the biggest thing in the news, which is the President Trump strikes on Iran and the recent ceasefire that was achieved by President Trump. So that's going to be the first half of the conversation. The second half of the conversation is going to be talking about a variety of legal matters. The release of Abrego Garcia and Mahmoud Khalil is ordered by district court judges, as well as a different district court judge deciding that they were going to straight up defy a Supreme Court ruling. So we'll have, two big topics today instead of the usual four, but there's plenty to talk about in each. So to kick it off, we'll start with Ben and Iran and Israel.
Well, thanks, Will. And since we last spoke, of course, there have been myriad developments in this war, which I think Donald Trump wants to dub it the 12-day war, where last week, towards the end of the week, the president told the world, essentially, I'm going to make a decision within 2 weeks on what the U.S. might or might not do with respect to Iran's nuclear program. This was after Israel had substantially degraded both some of its nuclear infrastructure, its ballistic missile stockpiles, its launchers, destroyed other strategic infrastructure of the malocracy. And then, of course, dramatically, the U.S. engaged in strikes. Three major sites struck, including Fordo, which was considered sort of the crown jewel of the crown jewels, the most hardened of the nuclear facilities for enriching uranium. We're still waiting for what the ultimate damage assessment is there, but this was, by all accounts, a dazzling and exceptional display of American might, as well as deception, as well as operational security, and a successful strike consistent with the president's narrow tactical objective with respect to Iran, which was can't have nuclear weapon, can't enrich uranium. So subsequent to that strike, Israel continued hitting much of the regime's infrastructure, some symbolic and some substantively significant sites. Iran responded with sort of a face-saving array of strikes on U.S. bases, namely in Qatar, which were coordinated, it appears, with the United States government, allowing the barrage of missiles to be shot down. That was the end of Iran's response, it appears, at this point. And then yesterday, and we're recording this, of course, on Tuesday, yesterday on Monday, late, there was word that a ceasefire would be inked over a 24-hour period, and we're still within that 24-hour period. So I guess we'll have to see what ultimately comes of it. There was strikes and counterstrikes in the time period during which that was announced. The president expressed his dissatisfaction with both Iran and Israel with respect to what transpired. There were Israeli civilians that were killed in one of those strikes. And so where we are today is, and this is a very fast-moving story, the president put out a Truth Social post indicating that Iran can now sell its oil to China again. There had been talk about Iran potentially closing the Straits of Hormuz, and notably, China pushed back on that, suggesting that they were to some extent sort of cutting Iran loose here. But this is an interesting development because obviously there are oil sanctions on Iran that we have enforced. So not clear if there's been a change in policy and what that looks like. Not clear what the discussions between the Trump administration, Israel, and Iran are going forward. There's all sorts of rumors about other developments in the Middle East vis-a-vis potentially expansion of Abraham Accords, for example, and beyond. So lots of different threads that we could pull at. And I'm happy to delve into any of them. I would just say at the outset, it was an amazing achievement by American firepower here to take out these nuclear sites and hopefully destroy them substantially. I was on record saying it was my preference, even though I thought it would be significantly more difficult and risky for Israel to independently carry out the strikes and destroy the facilities, which probably would have required sort of a special forces operation at Fordo, at least in part. And it's notable, I think, to think through what the implications and ramifications are of the U.S. acting here. And I think part of it is this was a bid to show that while the U.S. will seek diplomatic deals and to not engage in military action, when there are clearly defined objectives, the administration will act very aggressively and it will use overwhelming force. And it showed superiority and dominance here, enabled in part by our ally in Israel having basically total air control over Tehran. This also sends a message, of course, to the likes of Xi Jinping and others that, again, while America wants to deal, it doesn't want to engage in kinetic action, it will strike significant targets, including nuclear infrastructure like at Fordo. So lots of different implications and ramifications to it. We can also talk, of course, about, the president sort of said, well, why is regime change sort of a politically incorrect word, make Iran great again, and then has sort of totally thrown cold water on the notion that the malacracy is going away, is trying to emphasize that this is going to be a big trading partner potentially now. So all of these things are very live issues. We can talk about them from a national conservative perspective, what the national interest demands. Are Israel's objectives achieved ultimately, where you have a defanged malacracy, but the malacracy still stands? And Israel, of course, has been sort of ambiguous on whether or not it wants the malacracy to stay in power. Will it try to rebuild and refang essentially, and rebuild its missile program, nuclear program, et cetera, over time? All live issues. Happy to turn it over to the group for your thoughts.
Yeah, I found the president's quote on Tuesday morning when talking to the media about the apparent breaking of the ceasefire was sort of an all-time classic, where he said something along the lines of, when you have two countries who have been fighting for so long, they don't know what the F they're doing. Do you understand that? And he kind of stalked off, and it was sort of a rare moment of Trump actually getting openly frustrated in public. Obviously, he speaks aggressive at times, but you can kind of tell the difference from when he's sort of doing a showmanship type of aggression and when he's actually annoyed. And he was actually annoyed with the ceasefire being broken so quickly. And it was fascinating to see that sort of come out in public in front of the media. I think Ben raises a lot of really good points about what happens next. Does the ceasefire hold? What do negotiations with Iran look like? Trump has been trying to toe this very thin line between two of his campaign promises, one of which is Iran can't have a nuclear weapon. The other is no new wars. That's a difficult thing to achieve when you're talking about a regime that obviously doesn't have an interest in ending its nuclear program and repeatedly flouted the terms of the JCPOA and trying to continue to enrich uranium and build up that program. So I think a lot of the populist right was concerned about what a strike from America would mean. And so far, based on Iran's response, it was actually pretty de-escalatory. As Ben suggested, it was perhaps a performative strike, with 3 Iranian officials telling the New York Times that they had coordinated with the U.S. and Qatar, that the U.S. had moved most of its assets out of the Air Force or the air base where they launched those missiles. All of the missiles were intercepted. There were no casualties. And those officials even outright telling the New York Times that this was similar to 2020 after Trump assassinated General Soleimani, that they felt like they needed to respond to show some kind of strength, like they weren't just going to roll over and take it, but they also didn't want to take American life and risk even further retaliation from the United States. And since then, we haven't seen Iran do much else, if anything, to the U.S. besides a lot of tough talk to the media and on social media. I think, one of the other elements we can get into perhaps later in the segment is sort of the domestic politics of this and the splits in the Republican Party between the Thomas Massie types who have been urging Congress to have a debate on these issues, talking about the War Powers Act. You have Ted Cruz and Lindsey Graham, who have been more open about wanting regime change, which Trump has sort of waffled on publicly. And I think, one of the important things to understand about Trump's foreign policy is the unpredictability of it. And a lot of these public statements cannot be taken as gospel, but more as almost bargaining chips. And he puts them out publicly to throw off his negotiating partners and kind of leave all options on the table so that they never really know what they're going to get. But I'll let the group weigh in, and then I'm sure we'll get into some of the Republican Party infighting soon.
Yeah, I think, my big takeaway from this is I kind of look at the strike itself and the immediate ceasefire as very deeply connected because it's part of the same policy. And I'll explain what I mean by that. Israel was always going to want to achieve its war aims. It had complete air superiority over Iran. So there's however long the war was going to last, Israel was going to stick it out through eliminating Iran's nuclear program and severely degrading their ballistic missile capability. They had the ability on their own, as far as I can tell from reading, to eventually deal the Fordo nuclear plant. It might have meant special forces of Israel's going in to deal with it. It might have meant prolonged bombing campaigns. It might have been, both of those things would have taken a lot longer and would have been broadly more escalatory in the context of the war. They would have required the war to go on for a longer period of time and for more Iranians to die in the context of the fighting. The efficient way to deal and resolve this war aim, which is also an American national security interest, was for the Americans to go in with the B-2s and the bunker buster bombs and just do it in one bombing run. That's something Israel couldn't do. Israel would have required more time. So by doing this, I think that you see that it actually, even though it's an escalation in the sense of it's American getting involved, it's de-escalatory in the sense that it's resolving the primary aim of the war and doing so in a way that reduces the amount of collateral damage to Iranians. So that's point one. The second way in which it's de-escalatory is because it's America getting involved and helping the Israelis do this. Suddenly, when America says, okay, now we want the war to end, they're going to get taken seriously. Had America not intervened, if Trump had been yelling and screaming on Truth Social, Israel, you need to stop the war, it's not clear that Netanyahu could have done that and remain politically viable, because that would just be seen as bending the knee to the president. But in a world where the president had just on his own used extraordinary American military might to resolve one of Israel's war aims, there's a sense of indebtedness and gratitude that Israel has to have to President Trump. And so they're willing to let go, one of essentially the breach of the ceasefire that happened earlier this morning. As an overall take, this is a complete victory for the Israelis on the one hand, because it's the most dominant one-sided military performance we've ever seen. The single Israeli military member was killed, save for the one who was killed this morning when he was sleeping at home in his apartment, not on active duty. Otherwise, it's been complete. The only people the Iranians have managed to kill have been civilians they've been lobbing missiles at. So it's a complete victory there. It's also a complete victory for President Trump and a remarkable use of military force. Within 12 days, he's managed to achieve a major military objective for the United States without you losing a single American life or really even putting a single American at meaningful risk. The B-2s are obviously over Iranian airspace, but by that time, both the B-2s are technologically advanced enough to not really be at risk from Iranian air defenses, which had been destroyed anyway by the Israelis. So I think it's a coup. I think it's a remarkable victory. And I think President Trump is right, honestly, to push for a ceasefire and wrap up the war, having achieved the major war aims. And I think, Iran isn't necessarily going to be the victim of an imposed regime change from outside, but certainly their regime is weakened. And really, it's up to the Iranians what they want to do with that.
Yeah, I think this is a spectacular sort of victory for the United States for very little expenditure on our part relative to the war aims. The way that I agree with the way that Will laid it out. There have been 0 American lives lost. The way that this operation was conducted by our military, we've been impressed with the way that Israel has been conducting its military operations for the last 2 years. But this is a reminder that the U.S. military is actually the best in the world, because they coordinated. It wasn't a simple thing. They coordinated a bunch of decoys, and they coordinated 125 aircraft that were clearing the way to these strike zones, making sure that nothing could hit these bombers that took off from the other side of the world in Missouri and did, I think it's a 37-hour flight. Will had a very funny tweet actually on that point saying that, fortunately, apparently there is a small bathroom on board the B-2, right? So you didn't have to hold it for 37 hours, our pilots, but just an incredible job by the American military in a really, gutsy move by President Trump. In terms of American aims achieved here, obviously the nuclear program is the big one. It seems to be at minimum crippled. We don't know yet if it's totally destroyed. There are outstanding questions about nuclear material and where we go from here. We won't probably know the answers to those questions for a little bit longer. It's just hard to ascertain just how much of their program is destroyed. But when you combine it with Israel's strikes against their scientists, et cetera, it seems pretty clear that their program has at minimum been set back, many, many years here. So that's a huge one. That's been a stated foreign policy goal of the United States for basically, administration after administration. And in many such cases, everybody said they were going to do it. President Trump executed it and actually got it done. So that's the big one. Also, I think this tells us quite a lot about the relationships between our adversaries, right? So China and Russia essentially cut Iran loose here. And I think that's really good to know for the American government that they cut Iran loose, with the exception of China actually weighing in, telling Iran not to close the Straits of Hormuz very clearly, because they are dependent. About 50% of their petrol goes through the Straits of Hormuz, compared to America, which takes, just a few percentage of our oil. Now, global oil prices would spike, and that would be bad for the American people. But relative, in our sort of geopolitical Cold War with China, that was something that China was much more vulnerable to than us. They would actually be in real trouble if those straits were closed, as opposed to dealing with high prices for a determined amount of time. So that, I think, was interesting and worth noting. By the way, Amber noted something that Trump said about the Israelis and Iranians, very Trumpian truth on this to the Russians, because you have Medvedev, I can never pronounce his name, the number 2 in Russia, popping off online, talking about giving the Iranians nuclear material, giving them warheads. Trump had a very, very funny truth about how it's clear why Putin is the boss, and that world leaders should not be throwing around the N-word nuclear. So just a real Trumpian touch there. But I think it tells us a lot about the fact that, and the risk of escalating World War III sort of panic in perspective, the fact that did not happen because our major adversaries, as opposed to Iran, our major adversaries in the world, like Russia and ultimately China, did stand down in this case and cut Iran loose. There's the potential for a totally different Middle East, something that President Trump, the first term, was working on with the Abraham Accords. I think there's a continuous thread through Trump 1 and Trump 2 in terms of dealing with Iranian proxies and trying to actually bring some stability to the Middle East, so that the U.S. can essentially pivot away from it and not continue to spread ourselves thin. And then finally, and to me most important, the United States here has sent a very clear message, and Donald Trump has sent a very clear message, which is that there's a big stick on the alternative to the carrot, because these authoritarian dictators around the world, they have short memories. President Trump had to teach them the first time in the first Trump administration that his foreign policy is both the big carrot and the big stick, and you can choose which one you want. In this case, right, he had to remind them, I think, and he's really established American deterrence, and we'll have to see going forward. But I would not be surprised if this really enables him to cut the kind of peace deals that he's really been trying to get on the global stage, whether that's in the Ukrainian theater, whether that's relationships with China. I think that having this reminder that actually, President Trump is the hand, and you're going to get the hand of peace, or you're going to get the back of the hand from the Trump administration and from America under President Trump. And I think that was a really important thing to reestablish on the world stage. So overall, I think this is a good victory. There are still a lot of outstanding questions. The biggest one being what is going to happen in Iran going forward, whether the mullahs will stay in power, just greatly weakened, which may honestly be the most stable and potentially one of the better routes for the United States, or whether they'll collapse under their own weight internally without regime change from the outside. So I think those are all open questions. One final note on the legal side of things. It's very funny to see the Democrats, AOC filed, impeachment articles based on the fact that Trump did this strike unilaterally and did not go to Congress. Of course, Obama did that many, many times. And in fact, unlike some of the strikes in Syria and elsewhere, this is really clearly covered under the post 9/11 authorization of military force, because Iran was very much involved in 9/11 and in the planning and coordination around 9/11. There's a shakier case, I think, to be made. Like this piece of legislation is very clearly showing its age in terms of authorizing the president to deal with essentially terrorist groups as they existed post 9/11. But Iran is kind of the unchanging piece of that, which is why he's on such firm ground legally to do this unilaterally, I think, because Iran really has been funding terror and trying to kill Americans and trying to assassinate American leadership, including President Trump, for the entire time from 2001 all the way through yesterday, right? So I think that I think that's just going to go completely nowhere, and it's going to be fun. I think he truthed out to AOC with a bunch of funny insults, basically, make my day at the end of it, right? Go ahead, try impeaching me for the third time for something that is very, very clearly legal, has great legal standing, and by the way, has been done with less good legal standing by virtually every president for the last 30 years. So anyway, I think it was a gutsy call. It could have gone very, very wrong. It didn't. I'm glad I'm not the president and have to make these calls, but this was a good one for the United States.
Just tangentially on something you raised on the last point about Iran's hostility towards the U.S. While obviously the threat from the regime was most acute and existential for Israel, it's worth noting the history, obviously, that from the inception of the Islamic revolutionary regime there, they have shed Americans' blood, not only at the embassy, obviously, on the associated hostage crisis at the outset, but also the blood of American servicemen in Lebanon, at the Beirut barracks bombings, also the embassy bombings in Lebanon, to the Khobar Tower bombings, the hundreds of people who were killed by IEDs in Iraq and Afghanistan, and thousands more probably injured by them, all the way to the present day of the death threats on the heads of American leaders. There's never been full justice for this regime to the extent you can have justice in this military sense, but this is more than a bloody nose that they received, and it's well-deserved and a long time coming, given the death and the bloodshed that they've inflicted on Americans over the last 50 years. So I think that's worth stating. At least there's some modicum of justice now that their nuclear ambitions have been essentially destroyed, and hopefully that they can't wreak havoc through ballistic missiles and their terror proxies, which have also been flattened going forward. And I guess, again, then we'll have to see what it looks like. What does a defanged malacracy look like going forward? And will it be a destabilizing force in the region, or will it ultimately go by the wayside, however that goes down?
On the last point about the proxies, right? I think that October 7th, from the perspective of Iran and generally from its proxies in the Middle East, has to go down with Pearl Harbor in terms of one of the biggest backfiring missions, even laying aside the morality of it and slaughtering of civilians in such an uncivilized way. I mean, it really was the first domino to what appears to be a massive reduction in Iranian power that has been a fixture of the region for decades. So, yeah, bad call there.
And on Ben's point about the threat that Iran poses to the U.S., I actually really appreciated what Van Jones said on CNN recently, which was that everyone should be in agreement on the who and the why, which is Iran is a unique threat to the U.S. and they're trying to build nukes. Like, that's the who and that's the why. The question is the when and the how in terms of how you respond to that. And he sort of chided progressives who were trying to do this moral equivocation between America's history of slavery with the current Iranian suppression of its people, individuals like Whoopi Goldberg and Nina Turner, both making that really disgusting and obviously untrue argument. So to hear a little bit of moral clarity on that was nice.
Totally agree with that. So to transition, next we're going to be talking about judges releasing Abrego, Garcia, and Khalil. So I think we've talked about both these cases in detail. So obviously, Kilmar Abrego Garcia is the so-called Maryland man who's actually a member of MS-13, got deported to El Salvador, by mistake because he had an existing withholding of removal to El Salvador for a variety of reasons. We talked about that a million times, but he most recently got brought back to the United States under criminal charges, indicted in the Middle District of Tennessee to face charges of human trafficking. However, he has been he's not released from custody. He's given, I think he was granted bail or something on those charges, but the magistrate judge who issued the order also conceded that he will go right into ICE custody after this because he's still an illegal alien in removal proceedings. So there's the administration is not forced to remove him, or the administration is not forced to release him to the public, given that he's still an illegal alien and everybody agrees to that. The second major, and I think probably more damaging release, is that of Mahmoud Khalil. This is the Columbia student who was running the organization Columbia University Apartheid Divest, an aggressively pro-Hamas organization, apologists for October 7th. He had a green card, but he was detained and was going to have his green card canceled on a few different grounds. One of them was the Secretary of State making a determination that his presence was damaging to American foreign policy, which it is. We can go into that. The other is the fact that he lied on his visa application and on his green card application about his activities, namely being involved with this pro-Hamas student organization. Khalil got released by, I believe, a New York judge, or ordered released rather, which is odd because they don't really have jurisdiction over cases like these. It's a kind of continuing theme that also we're going to talk about in the next segment, which is district judges asserting jurisdiction over areas of law where they have been explicitly barred from exercising jurisdiction by Congress. That said, in this case, it's particularly obnoxious because these statutes aren't particularly vague. There's no reason to think that the Secretary of State should be able to say your presence does hurt our foreign policy. And in this case, it's clear that it did, because Hamas itself has said repeatedly that the vociferousness of American protests in favor of Hamas made them more reluctant to engage in ceasefires and negotiations over American hostages. So if you're talking about how is this damaging American foreign policy, there you go. You're giving succor to a terrorist group that we are trying to retrieve American citizens from. And the last point I'll make about Khalil before kicking it off the group is that the first thing he did upon getting back to New York was join yet another protest against Israel, saying he was going to support Palestinian rights, saying Israel's committing a genocide in Gaza, and protesting the Israeli war against Iran now over. So, the guy supposedly was out there to want to see his wife and kids, and rather it's clear that he's just honestly a hostile actor to this country. And I don't know what, he's essentially definitionally, he's not being removed under the Alien Enemies Act, but he's why the Alien Enemies Act exists. We don't need to tolerate foreigners agitating on behalf of our adversaries in this country.
I'll take the Abrego Garcia case because that's the one I've been following more closely. But I think, the overarching theme of it is how funny it is that he was chosen as the left's hobby horse, because basically no matter which avenue the government takes at this point in whether it's getting Abrego Garcia on these human trafficking charges, securing a conviction, which seems likely, frankly, based on just the evidence we have from the one human trafficking case in Tennessee, where he was pulled over with a dozen people in his car, none of whom had luggage, all of whom said that they were going to his Maryland house. He admitted that he was transporting them for his boss, who supposedly works in construction, from Texas to Maryland. Like, it's pretty open and shut that he was human trafficking, but now the government says that they have evidence that he was doing this over a period of a decade and had transported personally 1,000 or something illegal immigrants, or at least hundreds of illegal immigrants. Like, seems pretty clear that if that goes to court, he's going to be in big trouble. So they could get him in prison on a conviction, securing a conviction on those human trafficking allegations, or they could challenge the withholding of removal order based on the fact that he's a member of MS-13, which has been well established as well, with additional evidence since those first court documents came out from the U.S. government indicating that there were multiple confidential informants who identified him as a member of the gang. His brother-in-law was worried for Abrego Garcia's wife because he said that he was a gang member and she wouldn't be able to escape him and his abuse. And they apparently have even more evidence that he was part of MS-13 now. So, okay, he gets brought back from El Salvador, but the government now has multiple avenues with which to effectuate either his return back to the terrorist prison or to prison here in the United States. So, I mean, the long and short of it is that this is all a colossal waste of time and taxpayer resources fighting on behalf of a guy who is clearly a threat to American citizens, had no business being here in the first place. And with each passing moment and with each additional development in this case, it's become even more politically damaging for every Democrat who defended him.
Yeah, I mean, the wasted resources are the point, right? And that goes back to the due process debate, which I think is just particularly difficult to swallow from a party that thinks that American college students should be questioned by a star chamber if, you know, a girl says that she was too drunk when they hooked up last night. That it doesn't sit right with me. I know Joe Biden himself famously took the lead on those regulations under Obama. So it just, you know, as an aside, that really, you know, that really ticks me off, the fact that they were making this whole grandstanding thing about due process when they don't care about due process for Americans, right? But that really, on the substance of it, that's really the issue, right? The question is, what kind of process will allow us to deport dangerous illegal aliens at a rate that actually, you know, reverses the flood of illegal migrants that came here under Biden and many years prior, because administrations didn't do anything about it. But even this most recent surge under Joe Biden, because right now, if the process is this long and this expensive and involves this many appeals, it's functionally impossible to do. And that's where the big fight is going to be, because the American people very clearly voted for this to happen. And what the court's position, if they fully continue to rule in the way that the most liberal, and we can talk about in the next segment, you know, the problem with these essentially activists and rogue lower courts in, you know, very blue districts that are essentially setting policy for the United States. What they're saying is the American people are not allowed to vote to deport people who are illegally in the country, and everyone agrees that they're illegally in the country. And, you know, I've said this before, but that doesn't mean that we're against, quote unquote, due process. I'm totally in favor of due process. The process that's due to people illegally in the country is a venue to establish that they are, in fact, the person that the government is attempting to deport, and they are, in fact, illegally in the country. That's the process that they're due. So anyway, that is, you know, the function of a system, as Curtis Yarvin likes to write, or the function of a system is what it does. The function of this extended and in my view, with very little legal basis, required stretched out version of quote unquote due process. The purpose of it is to prevent the American people from actually being able to make the decision to get rid of the people who have been here illegally and are causing so many problems for basically, you know, every city and many, you know, small towns and particularly border states in America. So, you know, this is going to be the seat of the battle. And I do think that, you know, spectacular success in foreign policy aside, I think probably domestically, President Trump's second term will be judged more than anything else by whether or not he succeeds in actually fulfilling his word, the American people, to, you know, make a substantial dent. I'm not saying like it's unrealistic to expect that every single person we're going to catch and run down every single person who's illegally in the United States, you know, the millions and millions of people who are there. But I think, you know, the American people will accept a really, you know, good faith effort. And, you know, I think this is going to be the defining battle for the next 3 years of this administration, is between the courts that basically try to prevent the president from carrying out the mandate he was clearly given by the American people.
I just think the stakes of this, both of these matters, which are interrelated, are so high. And of course, the judiciary, certainly at the lower inferior court, so-called levels, is just not up to the task and on the wrong side. And yeah, I'm dubious of where the Supreme Court is ultimately going to come down. And this goes broadly for Alien Enemies Act generally. You know, does a judge have the right to determine whether or not the president made the right decision, essentially, in invoking the Alien Enemies Act, given certain conditions? There's an analog here, of course, for federalizing the National Guard. And of course, we're seeing judges question, essentially, the wisdom of a president in a whole slew of issues. And it's debatable whether or not these are justiciable issues. But I think top line, the question, we're operating in a paradigm now, which essentially says heads, illegal aliens and Hamasniks win and can operate with total impunity here, and tails, the American people lose. There's just no respect for sovereignty here. The notion that you have an inalienable right to come here and then propagandize on behalf of our enemies that have the blood of Americans on their hands, and that you supposedly have a constitutional right to do so, is utterly asinine. Of course, we can go back to laws on the books, for example, prohibiting members of the Communist Party from being allowed into the country. I'm sure there are plenty of self-styled civil libertarians today who would say that's unconstitutional and that's wrong. But you don't, as a non-American, you should not have a right to come here if you have beliefs that are inimical to Americans' beliefs, and you're going to operate in ways that are detrimental to our national interest as we define it. Otherwise, again, we don't have country, we don't have sovereignty. So I think these are both very cautionary tales that we're dealing with here. And it's sad that ultimately they're going to have to rise to the level of the Supreme Court to potentially allow for justice to be done. But meanwhile, how do you ameliorate the problems that have festered as a very consequence of a kind of system led by people who have the same views of these district court judges? It's a very fraught time, and it's a huge problem. And it's questionable whether any one administration in a 4-year period could grapple with it. But this administration is certainly trying to pull every lever that it can to do so, and kudos to it for doing so.
All right. Next topic is the defiance of a Supreme Court ruling in an Alien Enemies Act case. So just for some context, a judge, I believe, in Massachusetts enjoined the removal to third countries of a slew of very dangerous and undesirable illegal aliens who I believe are now hanging out in Eritrea or Ethiopia, or I don't remember exactly which country. But the Supreme Court put a stop to that yesterday with a 6-3 ruling staying the district court's injunction and saying, actually not really saying much more than that, but just attempting to stop the district court from doing this because for a kind of obvious reason, the district court doesn't have jurisdiction. It's an immigration matter. There's literally congressional statutes that say district courts don't get to rule on this stuff. And so that stay was put in place. But yet today, or I believe maybe last night, that judge in a very cutesy minute order said, well, you may have stayed the injunction, but you didn't say anything about the orders enforcing that injunction, which still order the government to refrain from removing any more of these people on this basis. Just now, we have the Solicitor General's filing straight to the Supreme Court asking them to clarify their ruling from yesterday, in reminding this district court judge that if you stay the injunction, you also remove the authority for that judge to enforce that injunction with any additional orders. So there's no reason why they should have to do that. And the Solicitor General, John Sauer, is asking not only for that clarification, but also on remand for this judge to be told not to issue any further injunctions or orders on this court unless given pre-clearance by the Supreme Court. And the SG is also suggesting that the Supreme Court order that this judge be removed from this case for failing to adhere to precedent. So it's actually a pretty dramatic ask from the SG. I'm curious to see what will happen. I expect pretty rapid action for the Supreme Court, because you have to understand that this was a very cutesy defiance of what the Supreme Court was trying to do, obviously, with their stay. And not only was it cutesy, it cited straight to the dissent in this Supreme Court case rather than the majority opinion. And boy, if you're talking about something that'll really anger the Supreme Court, it's a lower court judge kind of ignoring the substantive holding from the Supreme Court and then, going straight into a dissent. So it's remarkable that we have district judges trying to do this. The district judge in this case, Brian Murphy, has been on the bench not 5 months, and he's already defying the Supreme Court. I'm not sure. We don't have the votes to impeach the guy, but seriously, he certainly deserves it after something like this. And maybe I'll see if I can work with somebody in getting some articles filed. But anyway, curious about your thoughts on what this latest instance of explicit defiance, not merely the executive branch's authority, but of the Supreme Court itself.
Yeah, the lower courts have no independent constitutional jurisdiction. The Supreme Court has the Article 3 jurisdiction. And the lower courts they're just creatures of Congress. And this is exactly right. That this is unusual, to say the least. This is really unusual. Hopefully this will be finally something that pushes John Roberts over the edge. Although, people betting that way tend to lose over time with John Roberts. But this is a direct challenge to the way that the courts work in this country, and the direct challenge to the authority of the Supreme Court. And it's obvious that this guy is just playing for time, like how, basically using his office. It almost reminds me of, when Trump came in 2016, there were these just absolutely blatant #resist kind of conferences going on. Like there were public trainings for bureaucrats, unelected bureaucrats who wanted to use their office to resist. Now, obviously, the court is a different, a different creature and has some legitimate powers and has the power to sometimes restrain the executive or Congress, right? So it's not exactly the same situation, but the attitude to me is very similar, which is he's clearly stepped outside of the bounds of his office, but he's using his office to essentially do activism, to do politics. And that's just totally inappropriate. The Supreme Court should smack this down. Just as a side note, one of the kind of at least 50-50 positive negative decisions that came out recently from the Ninth Circuit of all places. Even the Ninth Circuit recognizes that in the recent case that Gavin Newsom made a lot of noise about bringing against Trump for nationalizing the control over the National Guard to actually bring some order to Los Angeles. Even the Ninth Circuit says Trump is maybe essentially it's a preliminary hearing, but it basically says like this order basically says that Trump had the power to command the National Guard in that instance, that he's well within the statutory bounds. However, it does remain so the court does reassert judicial review over that question, which is a really, really strange and inappropriate place for judicial review, because the way the statute is structured, it basically says the president has to make this determination that there is enough danger, that there is enough chaos, that this is required by either national security or domestic order. And so like the terms there are, they're clearly things that the court should leave as a political question for the president to determine. Like that's the purpose of that type of statute. You can't have the courts making those kinds of live time. Like the courts are the least suited branch to make those kinds of live time determinations. It's the same thing with the Alien and Enemies Act, with the Insurrection Act, right? Those kinds of determinations, what is a danger, like a present danger to the United States? Those are traditionally questions that courts try to give as much birth as possible to the president. That's part of the design of our system, that the president is the branch of our system that is able to respond to, immediate national threats like this. It doesn't mean that his power is completely unlimited or that judicial review is never appropriate in any of these kinds of circumstances. But this is a really outer bound, is what I would say. It's really pushing the outer boundary of where judicial review is appropriate, and I expect that piece of it to be appealed probably eventually again to the Supreme Court, which is going to have, until they start to rein in their lower courts, they're going to have this sort of continual emergency docket trying to put out fires started by their lower courts.
Just on that point, it is worth noting, underscoring the parallels in the Alien Enemies Act cases, federalizing in the National Guard. You're right to note that the Ninth Circuit, of course, caveats it by saying, well, of course, there's judicial review here. But the thing is, a president is not, first of all, if you look at these laws, it doesn't say presidents can assert these powers provided that a district court judge says that the conditions have been met necessary to assert these powers. The statutes don't even say Congress has to say that there's been a predatory incursion or there's been an invasion, or in the case of federalizing the National Guard, that there's a rebellion or that there's insufficient resources essentially to protect federal assets. In none of the cases, when you look at the laws, does it say that someone determines it other than the president. And there is a check on the president to the extent it's perceived that he is applying these powers in ways that are egregious or oversteps or inapt to the situation. And that is that Congress has a whole panoply of levers that it can pull to the extent it wants to constrain, punish, prohibit a president from asserting his authorities. That is never once mentioned, as far as I've seen, in any of these opinions challenging the president on invocation of the Alien Enemies Act, federalizing the National Guard, etc. As for this defiance of a lower court judge here, and that's what this really is. I mean, this obstructionism, and the left, of course, were the shoe on the other foot, call this insurrectionist kind of behavior. It calls to mind Justice Alito in the oral arguments over the birthright citizenship case that they heard this term, but which is really the legitimacy or illegitimacy of nationwide injunctions case, Trump v. Casa. He says during all oral arguments, all Article 3 judges are vulnerable to an occupational disease, which is the disease of thinking that I am right and I can do whatever I want. And this perfectly captures that posture among so many of the district court judges. And you have to hold the Supreme Court and the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court directly responsible for it, because they have allowed the lower courts to engage in this sort of mischief and to put forth asinine rulings with universal implications, not just nationwide, but universal implications. And under the guise of regular order, the Supreme Court says, well, we just have to let the injustice fester until it gets to us on appeal. But then you see the Supreme Court act totally out of turn in so many cases to effectively, for example, protect the purported rights of illegal aliens in this country. So the double standard is just absolutely glaring, and the mischief and the injustice and the radicalism of radicals in robes, tyrannical district court judges, is only going to continue to fester and get infinitely worse until and unless the Supreme Court puts a pin in it.
Yeah, I don't have much to add here because I think you all covered this really well. But I think there were a lot of people, I mean, across the political aisle, but on the right specifically, who I think were somewhat rightfully concerned by Stephen Miller's comments referring to a judicial coup in this country. And I think a lot of that distaste was because they didn't want to believe that it was happening. But to me, this is the clearest example yet that could be described as a judicial coup. Like, I don't know how else to describe it. So it seems to me that he's been completely vindicated in making that comment.
All right. With that, straight to final thoughts. I've got a quick one. New York Times has got a really nasty hit piece out against Emil Bove, trying to accuse him of not complying with court orders. The key thing to understand is that the judge behind this, or the lawyer behind this, filing this whistleblower complaint, is a person named Erez Ruveni, who is the same person who completely botched the Abrego Garcia case and actually violated his professional ethics in doing so. Namely, he actually, when the judge pressed him on what actions the administration was taking to return Abrego Garcia, Ruveni said to the judge, I've tried to ask my clients at the administration and they refuse to tell me, which is not something you can do as a lawyer. You don't get to blame your clients for things that you're representing them. It's not how the profession of law works. And in general, had done a terrible job on that case, was just conceding way, way, way too much, and not doing a job zealously defending the government. And it's all his word. He got fired for this, and now it's all his word against Emil Bove, who's done an outstanding job as DOJ. And I think you're going to see going forward, especially in his confirmation of it coming up, that Emil Bove is a really, really savvy guy and going to be a great judge.
Yeah, my final thoughts are, sitting here scared in New York City about the election that's happening, the Democratic primary that's happening today and has been ongoing last week. The two main candidates, it's a ranked choice system, which I'll get to in a minute, which is just another black mark on the ranked choice system. But the two main candidates are Andrew Cuomo and Zohran Mamdani, who is, if you think of a single just awful city urban policy that has destroyed a city in America from Chicago to DC to LA to San Francisco, Zohran is for it. Okay. He's pushed by the Democratic Socialists of America, the DSA here, which also has links to AOC, has endorsed him. So has Bernie. So are a bunch of celebrities. Emily Ratajkowski has come out and endorsed him. So he's got quite a lot of buzz and he is surging. So it's very difficult to poll in New York because of the ranked choice system. It's really difficult to predict how the results will shake out. The polling overall shows that Cuomo is ahead, but the question is by how much, because he's not going to meet almost certainly that 50% threshold that would end the ranked choice voting. So the way it works is that, he'll be first, but not by a lot. And if enough people put Zohran as their second or third choice candidate, then he may end up actually having more votes than Cuomo at the end of the ranked choice. So it seems pretty neck and neck right now. Just outrageous statements just to name one thing. I mean, he said every 2020 thing you can imagine, including over and over again that the police need to be defunded, which is something that he's running away from now. Although, he's such an ideologue, he can't even really run away from it. Like he just kind of weasel words it. He said, "Oh, I'm not going to defund the police. I'm just going to beef up the social services, and we're going to have the police deal with what they should be dealing with, violent criminals and so on," by which he means he's not going to send the police to deal with, for example, schizophrenics on the subway, right? So just really, I mean, even by New York standards, like imagine Andrew Cuomo being the hope of sanity in New York City, and you understand how bad this mayoral race is. That being said, even if Zohran wins this Democratic primary, we already have our current mayor, who I really like, Eric Adams, is going to run again as an independent. Cuomo may run as an independent. He's indicated that he's going to do that, even if he loses the Democratic primary. I'd hope those two guys figure out a way to work out which one of them is going to run, because they might tank it and give it to Zohran. But the race is not totally over. But obviously, having this guy as the standard bearer of the Democratic Party, there's a lot of blue voters in New York who are just going to vote blue, right? So it's a huge advantage to win this primary. It's the same way we got Alvin Bragg, who's very unpopular in the city, with like 10 or 13% of the vote, right? Because the Democratic primary voters in a closed primary choose the most lunatic person. And then, because the city is blue overall, even though the city is not representative. This is breaking down, by the way, the polling shows something very similar to the voters for Eric Adams in the primary. They're all going for Cuomo. So essentially, Hispanic and Black people in the outer boroughs in Queens and the Bronx, right, where they are dealing with crime, they don't like Zohran. It's rich liberals in Manhattan who deal with less crime, although not no crime, who are very excited about Zohran. So we'll see what happens. I'm kind of at the edge of my seat in a bad way. I really do think, and I'm famously on this podcast, like I don't think even Ben is way more black-pilled about New York than I am. I don't think, compared to other U.S. cities, New York is as psychotically liberal. Like it's liberal, but just to put a feather in my own cap, like I predicted, I was the only one on here, I think, or among a lot of conservatives who thought that Daniel Penny was going to get off, that a New York jury would not convict him. I don't think New York is as psychotically left as DC or San Francisco or, LA. But this guy is as bad or worse than the mayors of all of those cities. He might actually be worse. And that's probably a model that if they win in New York, Democrats are going to take national. So, just keep an eye on our election here and hope and pray.
My final thoughts are on this FCC official who worked for two Democratic senators, one of them being Ron Wyden. He was arrested in Northern Virginia recently for attempting to abduct and assault women from metro stations. And the latest development is that this individual was let out on bail because Arlington and Alexandria and even Fairfax County consistently vote for progressive prosecutors who don't want to do their jobs. So now you've got this woman snatcher out roaming the streets, apparently. So just another example of how important local politics is and how what seems like, to Inez's point about the rich white liberals, right? It's like the things that don't affect them, they just completely silo out of their politics. And while pretending to be compassionate, are actually providing great threat to people who are quite vulnerable, particularly on the issue of crime. And it's been very disturbing watching the developments in this particular case.
So I'll chime in briefly on New York. Yeah, I mean, Mamdani makes Bill de Blasio look like Barry Goldwater. It's that stark. And I always sort of say that in jest. And he also probably makes Bill de Blasio look competent, which is maybe even the scarier aspect of it. What a disaster it'll be for one of America's great cities. New York may not have the insane radicalism of some of the other jurisdictions that we've spoken to on this show, but this would be a suicidal move. Worth noting, of course, the Democrats are promoting ranked choice voting almost everywhere in this country, and this is a perfect example of probably why they want it. I am curious as to whether a New York mayoral race should be seen as its own kind of independent animal, or if it's actually a bellwether for what might happen nationally, and not just in urban areas, but also fast forwarding to the midterm elections as well, where and how Democrats are going to position themselves. But it's going to be a disaster for the city to the extent not only this is the Democrat nominee, but potentially its next mayor. One other positive note from this week is, and this is sort of in the weeds in the censorship industrial complex area, but the FTC approved a merger of two major advertising agencies. But as a condition of that merger, they're requiring those agencies essentially not to engage in boycotts on viewpoint discrimination grounds, which essentially refers to conservative and independent media outlets. And the backstory here is that one of the tactics used to try and silence conservative and independent voices is to try to put out of business entire outlets. And the way that the censorship industrial complex constituents or cohorts have executed this effort historically is that they say, we are not going to channel our advertising dollars and place ads on websites that traffic in dangerous dis, and malinformation, et cetera. And then they outsource determining what the blacklisted media companies are versus the whitelisted media companies to break their business models, essentially, by refusing to provide advertising dollars to anyone on the right. Well, the FTC is combating that in part through probes that they're engaged in right now to see whether or not there's collusive behavior in ideologically boycotting certain publications. But now it appears that in a merger that's taking place between two major behemoth advertising agencies, the FTC is making it a provision, a condition of the merger that they cannot engage in those sorts of boycotts, discriminating against essentially the right. So useful way to use their enforcement powers here. And it's going to be very interesting to see when we look back after these 4 years comprehensively what the administration's efforts look like. But clearly in sort of the antitrust area, that is one lever they are trying to use to once again free up the marketplace of ideas and stop the discrimination against conservatives.
Yeah, on that uncharacteristically optimistic point from Ben, that does it for us for this week. So on behalf of Ben, Will, and Amber, thanks for tuning in. I'm Inez Stepman, and we'll see you at the next NatCon Squad.